Welcome to Religious Studies 100. The topic for today's class is mysticism. Let me remind you that we talked about three important elements in all religious traditions: the mystical, the prophetic, and the apocalyptic or miraculous. So we began the semester by looking at some basic notions about religion, say definition of religion, reasons why people are religious, remember the functionalist, the substantive. Then we looked into the philosophy of religion a little bit with the cosmological and the ontological arguments for the existence of God. Then we looked at the sociological approaches to religion, and now we really get to the truly hardcore of our study of religion, and we begin with the mystical element. Okay? Now, the word mystical and mysticism may be used in different ways. You may use that word in a very trivial manner when you refer to clairvoyants or mind readers or cat readers, this kind of thing, right? If you go along Sunset Boulevard, you'll see these mystics, there's mystic shops on the sides where, for $5 they read your palm or stuff like that. Obviously, we're not using that sense of the word mystic in here. We're not referring to mystics as that kind of a thing. When we talk about mysticism, we are referring to a very intimate, personal, spiritual or psychic experience. Psychic not in the sense of these psychics who read your minds, but in the sense of your mental life. So it has to do with prayer. It has to do with intimate communication with what you consider to be the divine, with God. And we're going to review what scholars have said about mystical experience. And then we're going to see some examples of how people get to be a mystic, what we call a mystic. Okay? One name I want you to remember is William James. William James was a philosopher and psychologist of religion of the late 19th century and early 20th century. One of his best-known works is called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And in that book, he spends some time writing about mysticism. Now, William James believes that there are 4 marks of what he calls genuine mystical experience. We're going to talk about those characteristics of mystical experience. He also thinks that mystical experience can be obtained not just through religious practices, but also through the use of certain substances. For example, alcohol or certain anesthetics. Anesthetics were a big deal back in his day because they had just been discovered. So now you could have your teeth pulled out without horrible pain with the use of anesthetics. So that was a big deal back then. So the kind of happiness that you feel when you drink alcohol, it's a spiritual experience. We talked about this, I think, in one of our past classes. This idea that the brain contains these ultimate channels of communication between the material and the spiritual. And those channels can be stimulated somehow through the use of substances or through certain religious practices. If you go to a liquor store, you will see there were spirits in some boxes or in the walls, spirits referring to alcoholic drinks, because those are drinks that were thought to influence your spirit, to give you a low-level mystical experience, a low-level experience of getting out of this physical reality into a higher reality. And the same thing happens with certain drugs. Aldous Huxley, whom we have mentioned in a past class, but let me go over that again here. Aldous Huxley was a British author in mid-20th century who actually believed that through the use of certain drugs, you could access this higher spiritual experience, this non-physical experience. He did so. He came to California and he experimented with LSD and peyote, and he was thrown into this world of visions. We would call it today simply hallucinations, back in his day too, hallucinations. But by putting that label hallucinations, we're not really explaining anything. We know it happens in connection with certain substances. It doesn't really explain what happens in the person's mind when they have these visions. Another person who experimented with these kinds of substances, specifically with peyote, was Carlos Castaneda. Let me write both names here. Okay? So Aldous Huxley was one of them. Carlos Castaneda was the other one. Carlos Castaneda is a more recent author. He was a graduate student at UCLA in the late 60s, early 70s. He was doing his work on Native American witchcraft, and he got in contact with this old Indian sorcerer, Don Juan, in New Mexico, who introduced him to the secrets of Indian sorcery and religious practices, specifically with the use of peyote. Some Native American groups used peyote in their religious gatherings and rituals. By using peyote and following Don Juan's instructions very carefully, Castaneda reports in his books, his many books. The most famous one is called The Teachings of Don Juan, which is based on his PhD dissertation for the anthropology department at UCLA. He reports these visions and experiences he had. And so he was following a protocol. Now remember, Aldous Huxley was not following any protocol. He just used the substances. And so the experiences he had were, many of them, horrific. You can read about Huxley's experiences in his two little books called Heaven and Hell, one of them, and The Doors of Perception, the other one. Carlos Castaneda was following this protocol given by Don Juan, so he knew exactly what he had to say or do at every step when encountering these beings in this other dimension. Now this makes me think of the Tibetan or the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which contain instructions that the person is to follow after they die, and they enter this other dimension of reality. Okay? So what I'm doing here is I'm elaborating on this dualistic philosophy that sees body and soul as two realities that somehow come together in the human being, but that are separate, versus the materialistic view that says we're just matter. So Aldous Huxley and Carlos Castaneda were two dualistic thinkers, and mysticism falls squarely into that field of dualistic philosophy. And William James himself suggests that through the use of substances and through the performance of religious practices, ascetic practices specifically, we may access that reality for which our brain contains this ultimate channels of communication, which again can be stimulated through alcohol, other substances, anesthetics, or again religious practices or prayers, or stuff like that. Okay? Now, what are the characteristics of genuine mystical experience according to William James? Well, the most important one is ineffability. 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 Ineffability refers to the impossibility to put an experience you've had in words. You don't find the words. Now, this brings me back. Let me try to tie this up with our previous discussions in class. This brings me back to the notion that what we do in society is to play a role, like in a theater, like on a stage. Remember when we talked about the dramatic and the tragic at the beginning of the semester? And we said the dramatic is what can be expressed, and it's a role we learn. We learn a script. Since we are little, we learn everything. Then we think it comes out naturally of us, but it doesn't really come out that naturally. We learn how to gesture when we speak. We learn what words to use. We learn how to laugh, when to laugh, what to laugh at, and we make our choices. How to walk, how to behave, how to address someone who's more important than you are or less important, or a friend, an equal. We learn everything. It becomes part of our mental script, and we, depending on what situation we're in, we immediately access that script to know what line we have to say at that particular point. Okay? Now, sometimes it happens that we don't have a line for a certain thing, for a certain experience. Sometimes you're too happy or too sad, or something happens to you for which your script doesn't contain a line. That's a tragic aspect of our experience. Then the religious person feels that God, or this higher power, understands what's going on in your mind or in your soul without the need for a line, for putting that into words. You see what I mean? I mean, think of, for example, when you're trying to write a letter, a formal letter, petitioning something. Isn't that hard? That you can even buy a book giving you models for a job application letter, for a letter of interest. You know what I'm talking about? You go to a bookstore and there are books where you find models on how to write. You just fill in the blanks, but then the rest is written for you. Well, in a sense, that is what happens to us all the time. We have these forms in our mind that tells us, but suddenly we may find we run into experiences for which we don't have a script, we don't have a model, and then we don't know what to do. We don't know how to write that letter, so to say. We don't know how to express that. Well, that in itself is ineffability. Now, we all experience ineffability of one sort or another, and to some degree, actually very often, although we may not be aware of it. Okay? For example, imagine you're trying to describe your religious studies professor, that's me, to your mom, what he looks like, how he speaks. And he looks like, that neighbor across the street, like John or Peter, he's this tall, and when he smiles, and then when you look at him, like, do you think if I were to run, if your mom were to run into me at, say, the Santa Monica Mall, as soon as she saw me, she would go, "Oh, that's my son's teacher at CSUN, because he described him to me so clearly." Do you think that would happen? She would probably completely ignore me, even if you spent a whole day trying to describe me. She wouldn't even look at me. If she were to see me for just a split of a second, she would recognize me next time she sees me, right? But as far as words, what we can do with words is much less than we tend to think. If I try to describe you to someone else, I could say how tall you are, how you dress, and da-da-da, but as to the expression in her face and her eyes, and again, I would be completely at a loss with words. That's ineffability. Now, that happens with things at this low level, with things that we see, that we can compare to, that I can say, well, this girl looks like, that girl, I can establish comparisons. But now imagine I were to feel something which is so completely ahead of this reality, so completely out of this world, that I can't even compare it to anything in this world. Then I would be facing a major problem of ineffability, right? Imagine we were able to bring someone from the prehistorical times, a caveman, to our time. And we showed him a computer and cars and stuff like that, and then we sent him back to his time. how would he describe those things to his people? What would he compare a computer to? You know, back in, you know, whatever, 25,000 years ago. Or a car to, or clothing, or a building. What would he compare that to? How would he would be facing a major problem trying to explain that ineffability. Okay, he wouldn't have the words, the reference to compare it to, nothing. Well, imagine if it is just not a 20,000 year difference that we are talking about, but an absolute billions of years ahead, like the ultimate. And the mystic experiences that. How is that person going to explain that to us? Well, then when you read those texts in which the mystic tries to explain that experience he or she has had, it may sound confusing, like confused thought, or he or she may use images, metaphorical language. Say God is like the sea, or God contains everything. It's like ice and fire at the same time, trying to, or simply, as I said, kind of confused thought, like, I don't understand this, and that. Well, that's ineffability. Trying to explain something and see how the person gets into a true labyrinth, trying to explain things, but he or she can't. You find that in the mystical writings a lot. That's ineffability. We call that ineffability. Okay, the next mark of genuine mystical experience would be noetic quality. Noetic quality. Now, noetic comes from know. It's the same word as know, spelled differently. Like, I know this. You spell it K-N-O-W. Well, in this particular context, we spell it N-O-E, noetic quality. What that means is that the mystic claims to have acquired new knowledge. Now, why is that important? Because if the mystical experience is not real, if all it is just a fantasy, if it is just a person getting really high on his religious emotions, then the person hasn't acquired anything new. You know what I mean? Say we put her in a dark room next door, no light, we lock her in there. Then we take her out 3 hours later, and we ask her, what have you seen? Well, unless she had some apparition or something, she's going to say, I didn't see anything. And if she tells us, oh yeah, I saw whatever, I saw beautiful trees and a river, then we know she's lying, or she's making it up, she's fantasizing, or it's something that came out of her mind based on her previous experiences. But she didn't really acquire new knowledge of any kind because she didn't see anything. She was in a dark room, locked up for 3 hours. You see what I mean? So if the mystic is in this dark room and then he walks out and he says, yes, I have seen something else, then he's claiming his experience has noetic quality. He didn't make it up. It wasn't just his imagination. It wasn't just his getting high up into his emotional states. There was an actual contact with an outside reality. That's what he means. That's what this implies. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's noetic quality. Now, you need to understand that acquiring new knowledge is not just something you do by reading things or by listening to someone. That's really a very, very small way to acquire new knowledge. That's a very small part of our knowledge comes, although it may seem to you that that's the major way to acquire knowledge because you come here to school, you sit here, you read books. No, that's a very cultural kind of construction. We acquire new knowledge every time we see something, every time we touch something, we smell something, we hear something. We are acquiring new knowledge. If your mom sees me, she knows more about the way I look than everything you could tell her for days in a row. She has acquired new knowledge, which is far more complete than any knowledge we can transmit through words. You see what I mean? You see a painting, a famous painting, you have acquired new knowledge. Now you try to tell me what that painting is all about. It won't work. Okay? You're giving me very little knowledge with your words. Yes?
So, in order for someone to have the noetic characteristic, it doesn't necessarily mean they have to come back with new like knowledge as to what they learned, but just they have to see something different.
Her question is, for a person to have this noetic quality, they don't need to acquire new knowledge.
Like they don't need to learn something new; they just need to see something different.
But seeing or experiencing spiritually, whatever that is like, that is learning, that is acquiring new knowledge. What I'm saying is, we don't acquire new knowledge just by coming to class or reading books. That's a very, very small part of the knowledge that we acquire. Very small, okay? In reality, most of the knowledge we acquire comes through our senses, through seeing something. So every time I see a person, I have acquired so much knowledge. I see her face, what she looks like. If I were to tell someone what this person looks like, I would be really passing on very little knowledge only, okay? Okay, so that's noetic quality. Now, let's move on to the next characteristic, which is transiency. Transiency. Okay. Transiency means what it would mean to you normally. It's a transient experience. It passes quickly. It's not something which remains for a long time. In other words, mystics don't claim they're in this ecstasy state or this trance state for hours or days. No, it may be a matter of minutes or seconds. It is the intensity. It's getting into this new reality. So once you're in this trance, you lose track of time, and it doesn't feel like it was a few seconds. It may feel like a huge experience that, in ordinary terms, may have taken up years of your life, but you experience that in terms of, by our time, maybe seconds or minutes only, okay? Transiency. And then the last experience that, the last characteristic that William James mentions is passivity. Now, this applies mostly to the highest state of mystical experience, which is called union. We'll say more about this later. The idea being that a person cannot achieve, excuse me, the totality of mystical experience, the highest reaches of mystical experience on his or her own. It's a gift from God. You can initiate yourself in the mystic path, but you can only get so far. In order to reach this complete mystical experience, this complete experience of union with God, it has to be given to you as a gift from above. That's the idea. Now, what is this mystic path called? It's called the mystic way, or more technically, the via mystica in Latin, okay? Via mystica, or mystic way. Now, that mystic way is made up of 3 stages. That's how scholars look at it. The mystic way, or via mystica, is made up of 3 stages. The first one is purgation. Purgation. The word purgation has to do with purge, purging. Purgation. You know what a purge is? A way to eliminate toxins, to cleanse yourself physically, right? There are political purges too. You kill your enemies, you clean up, the political establishment. Um, and spiritually too, the way you purge yourself is through ascetic practices. That's how you clean yourself, how you cleanse yourself, spiritually speaking. We may have talked about this before, have we? How in the physical world we see the same kind of thing. No, we didn't talk about this before. Well, there seems to be a rule which applies both to the physical world and to the spiritual world. That if you want to do something, if you want to achieve purification, improvement, it has to be done through suffering of some sort. Okay? So if you want to make improvements on the physical level, if you want to be in, say, in good shape, what do? You lay on your couch, eating chips, drinking beer, and watching porn, or you go to the gym and work out and sweat it out. What do? You exercise, right? So that's the rule. You want to get your degree, what do? You go to the beach and lay out there every day, or you come to school, and right? So there seems to be a rule that applies to anything and everything you do. If you want to achieve something valuable, you have to suffer. The bottom line is suffer. We call it work. You know, when people say, "Oh, I love my workouts," that's BS. No one loves their workouts. You know that. People, you walk into a gym and it looks like a place of suffering. People like sorting out their lives. It's like, if you could achieve the same results just by taking a pill, a harmless pill, if you took it, you'd be in great shape. Wouldn't you do it? Wouldn't you do that? Instead of working out and suffering there every day and sweating it out? You would, right? Of course. So when people say, I love my workouts, what they really mean is I love to see the results. I mean, if you really love your workouts, if after working out a lot, you end up truly loving your workouts, then you're into something else called S&M. You're a masochist. Okay? It's not really, there can be a love of suffering. It's something which is unnatural. So when we work towards something, we work hard, we are making a payment in the form of suffering. We are making actually a payment in the form of suffering. That is the basis, by the way, of Christian theology. I'm sure you know of the atonement. You heard of the atonement. You heard this word before, right? The atonement really means the payment. The payment. In the case of Christian theology, it refers to the payment that Christians believe Jesus made for the sins of the world through his suffering, his death. The idea being the same as with actually a very simple one, in economics. Say Jaime borrows some money from, what's her name? Cash. Because he wants to make an investment, so he borrows $5,000, whatever. And then his investment goes wrong, he has no money. Well, there is a debt in there. There is an imbalance in Cash's account. And that debt can be paid in several ways. Either he works very hard to get the money and pay him back, or his dad pays Cash the money, or he makes a collecting and we collect money and we all put a little money each and pay Cash the money. Or Cash forgives him the debt, but if he forgives him the debt, who's paying for that? Who's paying the actual debt? He is, right? He's suffering the loss. In other words, the loss doesn't go up in smoke. Someone is going to suffer that loss, no matter what. Okay? So the idea in Christian theology is that by our rebellion against natural law, against the moral law, the will of God, we have created an imbalance. Sin, that's disobedience to God's will, has created this moral imbalance, this imbalance which has to be balanced out again. This debt, this imbalance has to be brought back to equilibrium. And that can only be made through a payment. And the idea in Christian theology is that Jesus paid that imbalance off with his sacrifice. But also, in traditional Christianity, the idea is that everyone can also make their own contributions to this payment, to increase this payment, to help others. And so there is room for people to practice self-denial, sacrifice, mortification, which is a contribution to this spiritual welfare, to which most of the payment was already contributed by Jesus, but leaving room for the contributions by humans. And so through this process of mortification, of putting up with your problems and losses and sufferings and diseases, willingly and patiently, you are, from the Christian viewpoint, you are contributing to your cleansing and to even to helping others who are in need of cleansing. Because you can pay for others, remember. Okay? You can also pay for others in traditional Christianity. That's not so in Protestant Christianity. That's still the same in Catholic and Orthodox, but that was changed in Protestant Christianity. Let me read to you a text which you have on your Moodle page from The Imitation of Christ, which is a classic of Christian spirituality, still used by many. This is a medieval text. I guess we're really talking about the 14th century or so. It's called The Royal Road of the Holy Cross. Now the word cross here stands for suffering. Okay? And this is the kind of advice that people wanting to go on the mystic way will read and follow. And generally speaking, spiritual people within the context of traditional Christianity before the Reformation and in today's Catholicism. Never place your whole trust and reliance in weak and mortal man, however helpful and dear to you he may be. Nor should you grieve overmuch if sometimes he opposes and contradicts you. Those who take your part today may tomorrow oppose you, for men are as changeable as the weather. Put your whole trust in God. What do you seek here, since this world is not your resting place? Your true home is in heaven. Therefore remember that all things of this world are transitory. All things are passing, and yourself with them. See that you do not cling to them, lest you become entangled and perish with them. Christ himself was despised by men, and in his direst need was abandoned by his friends and acquaintances to the insults of his enemies. Christ was willing to suffer and to be despised, and do you presume to complain? Christ had enemies and slanderers, and do you expect all men to be your friends and benefactors? Now listen to this, okay? It's pretty strong ascetic advice. Deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. To many these sayings of Jesus seem hard, but how much harder will it be to hear that word of doom, depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire. For those who now cheerfully bear and obey the word of the cross will not tremble to hear the sentence of eternal damnation. Why then do you fear to take up the cross, which is the road to the kingdom? In the cross, the cross stands for suffering. In the cross is salvation. In the cross is life. In the cross is protection against our enemies. In the cross is infusion of heavenly sweetness. In the cross is strength of mind. In the cross is joy of spirit. In the cross is excellence of virtue. In the cross is perfection of holiness. See how in the cross all things consist, and in dying on it all things depend. There is no other way to life and no true inner peace than the way of the cross and of daily self-denial. Go where you will, seek what you will find no higher way above, no safer way below than the road of the Holy Cross. Arrange and order all things to your own ideas and wishes, yet you will still find suffering to endure, whether you will or not. So you will always find the cross, for you will either endure bodily pain or suffer anguish of mind and spirit. Be assured of this, that you must live a dying life. And the more completely a man dies to self, the more he begins to live to God. There you are. Now you may be wondering, but why does it have to be that way? Why can we attain perfection and spiritual cleansing without having to suffer? Well, the author of The Imitation of Christ gives you an answer to that. It may not be satisfactory to you, but that's the answer he gives. He says, had there been a better way, more profitable to the salvation of mankind than suffering, then Christ would have revealed it in his word and life. In other words, his answer is basically, we don't know why it has to be this way. But had there been a better way to achieve spiritual perfection than suffering, then Christ would have taught us that way. So if he didn't, that means for whatever reason which we don't understand, which is part of God's mind, it has to be this way. So the ascetic practices purgation through mortification and self-denial, following these kinds of advices this kind of advice that I just read to you. Okay? And that's the first stage of the mystic way, purgation. That stage is referred to by many mystics as the dark night, as darkness. It's a time when you don't see anything. You see maybe a light at the end of the tunnel, but you're experiencing this darkness in the sense that you don't experience joy. You don't experience the joy of the senses because you voluntarily deprive yourself of every joy for the sake of spiritual perfection. So you want to eat, you don't eat. You feel thirsty, you don't drink. You want to buy something which is perfectly legitimate. There's nothing sinful in it, you don't buy it. You give your money to the poor. You feel pain, you don't complain. You want to talk to a friend to feel some consolation for some problem you had, you don't talk to a friend. You put up yourself with your problems. So it's like a dark night of the senses and of the soul. And that's how it is referred by Christian mystics, at least. But then, after this dark tunnel, comes the light, which you always saw at the end of the tunnel. And then when you enter that light, you see things for what they really are worth. And that's called illumination. Now let me explain what I mean by illumination. Think of how attached we are to certain things. How we overvalue some things. I wish I could give you a good example, but have you seen people sometimes that value very much things that are really unimportant to you? People who are willing to pay a huge amount of money for some, I don't know, some little thing that maybe something that belonged to someone else that you didn't even know the person is meaningless to you.
An action figure? Something like that?
A what?
Action figure?
Action figure?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
A toy? People cherish toys, but
Yeah. I was thinking of. I wish I could find a good example. Memorabilia, for example. Say you go to another country and there is this very famous guy there, someone like Michael Jackson here or something, but you never heard of him before. And there is this auction where they're gonna have this memorabilia from this person or something. And you see people willing to give there, $1,000, $5,000, $10,000 for some little book or something that belonged to this person, and you would never give that money for that because it means nothing to you. I mean, if you were, even if you were to possess that, it would really mean nothing to you. You know what I mean? It's not the best example, but you know, I remember once I saw this long line of people waiting to have their books signed by some important person who was important to them, but I had never really heard of him. It's like some athlete. I'm not into American football or anything, so I have never heard of him before. And this guy had written a book about his life or something. And then I thought, wow, it'd be nice to have, he seems to be so important. And since I'm here, I might as well get a book and have him sign for me, who knows. And so I said, well, how much is the book? And they were selling the book for like $60 or something. I thought, it's only $60. And people were like crazy trying to buying the books for $60 because they would have his signature. And I go, what, $60 for this? This guy I don't even know. Forget it, I'll never buy that. Well, if we had that attitude in relation to all material things, I mean, if my computer breaks down, I mean, let's be honest. If your computer breaks down or your cell phone breaks down or your car breaks down, we are so attached to those things. I mean, if any of those things break down, not to say the three of them at the same time, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Suicide, right? That's the end of life. We are so attached to these things. Now, when there were no computers and no cell phones, we lived without them, no big deal, or without internet. But the more stuff we have, it's like the more attached we are to it and the more we want. Well, if we, I'm sure some of you may have some grandma or grandpa who, well, you're too young maybe, but your maybe grandpa or grandma who a computer means nothing to her and the internet means nothing to her. And, having a car is no big deal to her or to him. And a cell phone, they probably don't own one, and it's no big deal to them. And so if it happens to break, you know what I mean? Well, that's the stage of illumination. If we were able to see things for what they really are, to see that their worth, that the added value is what keeps us enslaved and makes us suffer because we want this and we want that and we suffer and when we don't have that and we have money to buy this or that or we lose this or something breaks down. If we were able to finally break with those ties and see things for what they really are and just be able to say, hey, you want my computer? Sure, you can have it. I don't care. Come on, take it home. It's for you. And don't feel bad or anything. Just walk away with no. Then we have attained illumination, the stage of illumination. A higher stage in the mystic way than just cleansing. Because during the stage of cleansing, you actually suffer when you lose something. You see? I lose my computer, or I give it to her, and I'm not going to complain. I'm going to put up with the suffering that causes me that loss. See? But I still suffer. When I come to a point in which I don't suffer anymore because I don't feel any attachment to things, then I've reached illumination. And then the third stage is union. Union. Now, union is the highest possible stage in mystical experience. And then that's where passivity truly applies. The mystic never claims to have achieved union with God or with the divine through his or her own efforts. Once a mystic achieves union, a Christian mystic or a Muslim mystic or any other mystic, they achieve something which in mystical literature is called copula mystica. Which is, copulate means sexual union, but in this case it means a complete union, fusion with the divine. I mean, the mystic claims to really have become one with God. One with God. So sometimes mystics speak as if they were God because they have achieved this total union with God, this copula mystica. And we find that in Sufi mysticism, which is Islamic mysticism. Sufism or Sufi, that's the name for the Islamic mystics. And you have to read some of the Islamic mystics for this part of the semester. It's on your reader. And Jewish mysticism, it varies a little bit. In Jewish mysticism, we have the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah is a different type of mysticism. These categories we have studied today do not really apply to the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah is a more speculative kind of mysticism. It's a kind of actually it's more rationalistic, that's what it is, than this kind of mysticism which we find in other religions. So all we have learned would not apply to the Kabbalah. It would apply to Christian mysticism. It would apply to Islamic mysticism. It would apply to some forms of Eastern mysticism, Hindu mysticism, but not to Buddhist mysticism, because in Buddhism there is no notion of this ultimate God that your soul may unite with. And in Jewish mysticism, perhaps to some forms of mysticism, but not to the best known form of Jewish mysticism, which is the Kabbalah. Now, what do scholars say about mysticism in general? Well, they are divided. Some scholars believe that mystical experience is genuine, that mystics truly access another reality, spiritual reality. And those scholars are classified under what we call the perennial philosophy school. And we call it the perennial philosophy school after Aldous Huxley's book, The Perennial Philosophy. Aldous Huxley was very interested in religion. You probably heard of Huxley through other works of his, such as Brave New World. I'm sure you heard of Brave New World, that futuristic novel, science fiction novel. And not actually science fiction, rather futuristic. And but he was also very interested in religion. And he wrote this anthology. It's actually an anthology of mysticism in which he puts side by side texts of the mystics from different religions of the world. And he's basically telling you, look, they use a different language, different imagery, different metaphors, but they're all talking about the same experience. In essence, they're all saying the same. And they lived at different times, different historical contexts and cultural contexts, different religions. But if you analyze them carefully enough, they're all saying exactly the same. Therefore, mysticism is a genuine experience. It's a true experience that some people have. It is not their invention or just a high emotional state. It is a true experience they have. And they describe it in different religions, at different times, different language, but they're talking about the same. So scholars who believe that side with what I will call the perennial philosophy school after Huxley. Those who do not believe that, those who think that mysticism is not a genuine experience, but just a very intense emotional experience some people have, side with what is called the acculturation school. The acculturation school. So those scholars think, no. All instances of mystical experience can be explained easily in terms of the personal beliefs of the mystic, his or her historical situation, his or her culture. So beliefs, culture, history, personal experiences will be enough to account for what these guys are saying. They get very high in their religious emotions, and so they kind of feel or deceive themselves into believing that they are actually accessing some higher realm, but they're not. So these are the two schools of mysticism. Okay, this pretty much covers all I wanted to say, the theory of mysticism. Now, time for questions, if there are any, or comments, or clarifications. Anything I said was not very clear? Nothing? Yes, one question.
Is the Via Mystica fall under the passivity of the,
No,
or is that something totally separate from these four?
it's separate, yeah, it's separate. So anyone who goes through the 3 stages of the mystic way, okay, especially as they approach union, will experience this.
Along the way.
Yeah. Excuse me, we're still in class. Stop the little noise. We have a question here, which is actually very important. Yeah, anyone following the mystic way, the more they get into the advanced stages of the mystic way, they will experience these characteristics with more intensity. Ineffability will be more intense the more they approach illumination, especially union. Okay? Generally speaking, we tend to call mystic, in a very technical sense, only those who have achieved union, who claim to have achieved union with the divine. Okay? But in a more general sense, the word really applies to anyone following the mystic way, even that of purgation only. Some people stay in the purgative stage for their whole lives. They're ascetics. They never really reach the light, much less union. They spend their lives working towards it through self-denial and mortification. Okay, thank you.